Did Pope Leo XIV just contradict his predecessor, Pope Francis? Can the magisterium contradict itself? If so, in what instances? Has it historically contradicted itself in various instances, such as perhaps outside the church there is no salvation, religious liberty, usury, slavery, many other topics? That's what I want to talk about today, especially focusing on something from Pope Leo XIV's homily this morning that really brings up this question. Before we dive into that specifically, I want to remind you, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. I'd greatly appreciate your support of the channel. So we've talked a little bit about how the magisterium works. In fact, I actually just posted a video about an hour ago talking about how the magisterium works. So maybe go and watch that if you haven't already. We've talked about that a lot here on this channel. We've also spoken about the question of how the magisterium teaches definitively versus non-definitively. We've even spoken of the question of magisterial reversals, which is the subject of my doctoral dissertation. So it's a topic I'm incredibly interested in. And so whenever something comes up where it looks like one pope is contradicting another pope, it catches my attention because that's an area that's of great interest to me. Can the magisterium contradict itself? Let's maybe start there, generally speaking, and then let's dive into what Pope Leo XIV said. Well, can the magisterium contradict itself? Yes and no. Depends on what aspect of the magisterium we're talking about, or what kind of teaching. There are some teachings that are definitive in nature. There are some magisterial acts that employ, from the Catholic paradigm, the charism of infallibility. So whenever they're taught with this charism, the proposition is without error. That's what infallibility means. And so sometimes popes exercise this charism in ex cathedra teachings. Sometimes ecumenical councils exercise this charism in solemn definitions. Can the magisterium contradict itself when it comes to infallible teachings? Well, you certainly cannot have one infallible proposition contradicting another infallible proposition, because one of those two propositions at the very least would actually be non-infallible, because those things that are without error are not going to contradict each other. So if there's a contradiction, one of them at the very least is with error and therefore non-infallible. So if we're just speaking about definitive or infallible teachings, one infallible teaching cannot contradict another. But what about non-infallible teachings, non-definitive acts of the magisterium? We, of course, know that the magisterium can teach in both ways, either definitively or non-definitively. A pope or the College of Bishops, an ecumenical council, can teach either infallibly or non-infallibly. So can a non-infallible teaching contradict an infallible teaching? Theoretically, of course, it could. If one is not infallible, by definition, it's potentially false. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is, but it's potentially fallible. And that which is potentially fallible could contradict that which is infallible. Just in theory, right? And then certainly a non-infallible teaching could contradict, in theory, another non-infallible teaching, right? Pretty straightforward. So if you're going to speak of infallibility, you have to concede that there are some acts that are non-infallible. Otherwise, if everything that the magisterium teaches is infallible, then there is no need in even determining what is ex cathedra versus what's not. Everything becomes ex cathedra at that point. Everything becomes a solemn definition at that point. which is obviously nonsensical and is not what the Catholic Church teaches. It does teach, it can teach non-definitively. You can see that, for example, in the third concluding paragraph of the Profession of Faith promulgated by Pope St. John Paul II, among many other places. So, in theory, yes, there could be a contradiction between something non-infallible and another non-infallible, or a non-infallible and an infallible proposition. There could be, in theory. Now, some have said that actually the magisterium has contradicted itself many times. There's been many people who have argued that. Again, that's the subject of my doctoral dissertation, examining those instances, the common ones: slavery, usury, outside the church there is no salvation, limbo, religious freedom. And some will attempt to harmonize these things and say, no, they don't necessarily contradict each other. Death penalty might be another. Others will say, no. There's no way to harmonize them. They contradict each other. So there's been a debate, an ongoing debate about some of those topics. So some have said, well, it appears that in theory, the magisterium could contradict itself, but it hasn't. Others would say, well, in theory, it could contradict itself, and it actually has in practice. There's different views. Will that debate change as of today in light of what we're about to see from Pope Leo XIV? You see, Pope Leo XIV in his homily today, which is a magisterial act, it's admittedly very low on the level of papal magisterium. It's at the very bottom, if you will. It's an incredibly low act of papal authority. But the papal homilies would still be part of the papal magisterium, especially since it's being published before the entire world like this. It's clearly a teaching act of the Pope. You see, Pope Leo XIV just today in his homily says that marriage is not the ideal. He says, I would remind all married couples that marriage is not an ideal. I'll actually show that to you here in just a second. But you compare that to some things where Pope Francis has spoken of marriage as the ideal, and some might say, well, there you go. There's a perfect example of how popes are contradicting themselves in their official role, in their official capacity, not in some kind of non-magisterial capacity where you're speaking as a private theologian, where a pope is just writing some regular book as a private theologian, like Benedict did with his Jesus of Nazareth books, or some interview that a pope gives on an airplane. We're not talking about instances like that. We're talking about instances where one pope says one thing, another pope says another, but they're both acting in their capacity as pope and teaching magisterially. And to answer your question, thank you for the super chat. Does the church normally teach non-definitively? Yes, it normally does. Let me show you something from Pope Leo XIV. Share my screen so you can see right around now. You should be able to see. Homily of the Holy Father Leo XIV from today at St. Peter's Square, 7th Sunday of Easter. He says, in recent decades, we've received a sign that fills us with joy, but also makes us think. Let me maybe zoom in on that so you can see it a little bit better. In fact, that several spouses have been beatified and canonized, not separately, but as married couples. I think of Louis and Zélie Martin, the parents of Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus, and Blessed Luigi and Maria Beltramine, who raised a family in Rome in the last century. And let us not forget the Ulma family from Poland, parents and children united in love and martyrdom. I said that this is a sign that makes us think. By pointing to them as exemplary witnesses of married life, the church tells us that today's world needs the marriage covenant in order to know and accept God's love and to defeat, thanks to its unifying and reconciling power, the forces that break down relationships and societies. And now here's what he says. Watch this. For this reason, with a heart filled with gratitude and hope, I would remind all married couples that marriage is not an ideal, but the measure of true love between a man and a woman. A love that is total, faithful, and fruitful. This love makes you one flesh and enables you in the image of God to bestow the gift of life. Now, notice the thrust, however, is. It says, I would remind all married couples that marriage is not an ideal. Not an ideal. Okay? Well, again, this is a magisterial act, pretty low on the magisterium totem pole, but certainly magisterial nonetheless. Okay, so he says it's not the ideal. Now, compare that to Pope Francis. In many instances, many from Amoris Laetitia, who seems to say the opposite. Here's one example. The ideal of marriage, marked by commitment to exclusivity and stability, is swept aside whenever it proves inconvenient or tiresome. Now, wait, I thought marriage wasn't an ideal. Then he says it is an ideal. Elsewhere in the same document, Pope Francis says some forms of union radically contradict this ideal. What ideal? The ideal of marriage. He says some unions contradict the ideal of marriage. Homosexual unions, for instance. It says, while others realize it in at least a partial and analogous way. So some unions contradict the ideal of marriage. Others are partially reflective of it. Perhaps he has in mind cohabitating heterosexual couples. But here you see, again, it's referred to as the ideal from the same document. All the same, the rejection of distortions of sexuality and eroticism should never lead us to a disparagement or neglect of sexuality and eros in themselves. The ideal of marriage cannot be seen as purely as generous donation and self-sacrifice, where each spouse renounces all personal needs and seeks only the other's good without concern for personal satisfaction. Well, once again, very clearly, it's spoken of as an ideal, especially in comparison with other unions, as we saw just moments ago. It continues. It says elsewhere, naturally, if someone flaunts an objective sin as if it were part of the Christian ideal, or wants to impose something other than what the church teaches, he or she can in no way presume to teach or preach to others. This is a case of something which separates from the community. Such a person needs to listen once more to the gospel message, and it's called a conversion. It's talking about people who want to present their disordered unions that are not marriages, but are disordered unions, and they present them as the ideal. Well, wait, I thought there wasn't an ideal. Well, Amoris Laetitia is saying there is. Elsewhere in the same document, it continues to repeat this notion. In order to avoid all misunderstanding, I would point out that in no way must the church desist from proposing the full ideal of marriage, God's plan in all its grandeur. The full ideal of marriage. But wait, there's more. It elsewhere says it must remain clear that this is not the ideal which the gospel proposes for marriage and the family. Talking about the situation of divorcees Another thing is a new union arising from a recent divorce with all the suffering and confusion which this entails for children and entire families, or the case of someone who has not consistently or who has consistently failed in their obligations to the family. It says that's not the ideal of marriage. Okay, so we're seeing over and over and over and over and over Amor Laetitia saying marriage is the ideal. And by the way, this isn't the only document from the magisterium that speaks of marriage this way. One second. It's not the only instance, but it is a noteworthy one. But I showed you maybe about 6 or 7 examples. Now, is Amor Laetitia magisterial? Don't let certain cardinals fool you. Don't listen to the cardinals who tell you it's not magisterial. It very, very much is magisterial, whether you like it or not, for better or worse. Post-synodal apostolic exhortations are magisterial. In fact, they would be slightly higher than a papal encyclical. So they are very much magisterial. Okay, so you have the magisterium on the one hand, Pope Leo XIV saying, marriage is not an ideal. I would remind all married couples that marriage is not an ideal, but it's the measure of true love between a man and a woman. He's basically saying it's not this ideal that you live up to. This is the this is the standard of love. Whereas Amor Laetitia is saying, hey, marriage, it's this ideal, and there's these other unions, some of them contradict it, and there's these other unions that maybe partially reflect it in some kind of analogous way, but marriage is an ideal. Well, people will debate endlessly if there is an absolute contradiction here. Perhaps some might say, well, here's what he's talking about contextually, and here's what Pope Francis was talking about contextually, and show how it's maybe not an absolute contradiction. Let's assume for a moment that it is. Let's assume for a moment it is. To which proposition would you give assent? Is it the case that if the church contradicts itself in its magisterial acts, that you just go with the most frequent teaching? Some say, yeah, you just go with the most frequent teaching because that's more in line with the mind of the church. Seems to beg the question, though. How do you know that's more in line with the mind of the church? Maybe the mind of the church was expressed very sufficiently previously. Well, you do have this from Donum Veritatis, which is itself magisterial. Here's what the document says. When it comes, or the willingness to submit loyally to the teaching of the magisterium on matters per se, not irreformable, must be the rule. So it's talking about you normally need to accept things that are not infallible. It has to be the rule. It can happen, however, that a theologian may, according to the case, raise questions regarding the timeliness, the form, or even the contents of magisterial interventions. Here, the theologian will need, first of all, to assess accurately the authoritativeness of the interventions, which becomes clear from the nature of the documents, the insistence with which the teaching is repeated, and the very way in which it is expressed. Now, this is actually building from Lumen Gentium, paragraph 25, if I recall correctly. And it effectively is repeating that right here in Donum Veritatis. But notice what it's saying. How do you know how authoritative something is? Well, you consider the document that it's within, the nature of the document, how often it's repeated, and how it's expressed, among other things. This is not exhaustive. I have a whole course on everything that would increase the weight of a teaching. Have that with Catholic Polytechnic University, and we look at that and we go over numerous magisterial interventions and we weigh them. But here's a few that the magisterium points out here conveniently: the document type, how often it's repeated, and the force, the language that's used. That will increase, that will make something more authoritative. Now, let me ask you a question. If you have Pope Francis teaching one thing in an apostolic exhortation, then Pope Leo teaching another thing in a homily, and let's assume there's an absolute contradiction, already which one is more authoritative, all other things being equal? An apostolic exhortation or a papal homily? Apostolic exhortation is more authoritative, right? All other things being equal, apostolic exhortation. But all things aren't equal here, because there's actually more that increases the weight of one of the propositions, and that is the repetition. Now, how many times did we see the claim that marriage is an ideal repeated in Amor Laetitia? And that's just considering it within one document. There's other documents. Well, it was repeated a lot. A lot. Okay. How many times did Pope Leo say that marriage is not the ideal? That it's not an ideal? Only once, right? So if there were an absolute contradiction, which one would outweigh the other? Just based on that. Amor Laetitia. Right, so combine those together. One instance from the papal homily versus maybe a dozen instances from an apostolic exhortation. Obviously, if you're going to say there's an absolute contradiction, which one do you have to accept? You would have to accept and give your religious submission of intellect and will to Amor Laetitia, because it's of a higher grade as far as the document and repeated more times. Now, some might say, well, there isn't an absolute contradiction. He's not saying that marriage isn't an ideal, but we shouldn't just look at it as like it's some lofty ideal that's hard to achieve kind of thing. That's what he's talking about there. But what Amor Laetitia is talking about, it's not talking about that. It's talking about marriage is an ideal in comparison to others that are partial, partial fulfillments of the ideal, and then contradictions to the ideal. So there's not an absolute contradiction. I'm sure that debate will rage on for quite some time, and people will debate on whether or not there actually is a contradiction. But my question to y'all was, okay, if there is one, which one would you go with? I suspect many people would just go with Pope Leo, right? Because maybe he's the most recent, or maybe they like him more. But is that the way the magisterium works? Yeah, no, that's not how the magisterium works. According to what we saw, the way the weight of a teaching is registered is through nature of documents, how often it's repeated, way in which it's expressed. Now, I see there are some things in the chat. I wanted to grab those. Do you think Pope Leo's comment is slow rolling acceptance of same-sex marriage? No, I didn't read him that way at all. I'm sorry. I guess I don't see how you would come to that conclusion. I don't think he's saying it's not the ideal insofar as homosexual unions are just as good as marriage. That's not what he meant. He meant, like, don't speak of marriage as an ideal as if it's not something that you can't attain. This is the standard of love, is what he's saying. It's not some ideal, some lofty thing that you can't achieve. No, this is the standard of love. Is there an absolute contradiction with what he's saying with Amor Laetitia? If you want my personal opinion, no, there's no absolute contradiction here. On the surface, there's a surface contradiction, in the same way that, there's surface contradictions in the Bible. Answer a fool, and according to his folly or something like that. But then it tells you right after that, don't answer a fool. Tells you one verse, answer a fool. Then it tells you next verse, don't answer a fool. Is there a contradiction on the surface? But no, I think that there's not an absolute contradiction, right? I think what it's saying is either way, no matter whether you answer a fool or not, you're going to lose either way. And I've found that to be true. Whether you answer the fool or not, you'll lose either way. There's no winning with a fool. I think that's effectively what's going on here. There's something on the surface that looks like it contradicts itself, but I see what both are doing, and they're coming from very different angles here. I don't think they're absolutely contradicting themselves. But if they did, of course, the magisterium can do that. We already know that. And in that case, you would assent to Mors Laetitia. If there were going to be a contradiction with a Mors Laetitia, though, I don't think that this is something that people would have wanted. I think that they would have wanted the judgment of granting communion for divorced and remarried people without an annulment in some cases. I think they would have wanted that contradicted by Pope Leo. Of course, he didn't contradict that, though. Maybe he will. Maybe he'll reverse that practice. Doubt it. Doubt it very seriously, but we'll see. Anyways, I hope this has been a helpful exercise in considering how the magisterium works and determining to what proposition does one owe assent if there's a contradiction. I thought it was an interesting situation that helps us kind of illustrate this and how the magisterium works and conceive of these things and theorize, how the magisterium operates and all of that. So I thought it was a fascinating instance. If you did too, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. I would definitely appreciate your support. I'm going to review that video with Jordan Peterson and 20 Atheists tomorrow. Boy, where do I start with that one? I'm not even going to begin to tackle it today. I'm waiting for tomorrow. So if you want to see more videos, especially if you want to see that one, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell for notification. That's going to do it for today. See y'all later.